Good morning, afternoon, or evening, folks, and welcome to Cast of All Trades, the show where we talk about developing skills, exploring ideas, and following curiosity. My name's Orion, and in this episode, I talk about 10 habits that foster creativity and 4 central principles on creativity. My hope is that you'll be able to take these 10 habits and 4 central principles and apply them to your life to become more creative overall. So let's get into it. So, what are my most effective habits for fostering creativity and coming up with new ideas? First and foremost, it has to be workouts. An active body leads to an active mind, and with the body and mind being so closely tied together, it's more important than most people believe to take care of both of them. Oftentimes, if you want to change your mind, you have to change your body. And if you want to change your body, you have to change your mind. There have been a number of studies showing that exercising regularly can be just as, if not more effective for overcoming depression than medication. Now, I am not a scientist, so I would recommend going out and talking to a professional therapist, going to someone else to talk about depression or anything like that. But the main reason I bring up these studies is just to show how closely related and how closely tied your mind and body are together. So if you want to be more creative, you gotta first take care of your body. Sometimes being active, picking up and putting down heavy objects, going for a run, going and doing a bunch of body weight exercises, stuff like that. Oftentimes, that's when I get my most creative ideas, by just doing something simple and repetitive over and over and over again. Make my body feel sore, make my blood start pumping, get the blood pumping to my brain, and in all of that, suddenly I get a flash of an idea. I get a strike of inspiration. I think, oh, heck yeah, that's a great idea. Let me go write that down real quick. So in between sets, I'll go pull out my notebook, I'll jot it down, like, awesome. Let's get back to it. Feel good, think awesome, that's great. Second habit that I want to bring up is walking, showering, mindless activities, stuff like that. For me, walks are probably one of the best places that I can do this. A good relaxing walk can be one of the best habits for fostering creativity and just being healthy in general. There's nothing quite like waking up in the morning, doing a good workout, getting a great idea, then deciding, I'm going to go for a walk after this. Go step outside, take a nice walk along a trail, a nice familiar trail. First thing in the morning, get some bright light shining in your eyes, feel the breeze flow through your hair, just going around a familiar walk. On those walks, if you're doing these activities with intention of being creative and coming up with more creative ideas, I would recommend you learn how your brain reacts to music. Here's why. Can you actually think of new ideas while you're listening to music, or do you get too sucked into it? There's a number of people that I know that they love to listen to music while they do things, but while they're listening to music, they're far less effective at doing the things they're trying to first and foremost do. So if you're trying to be creative and come up with ideas, you have to figure out, can you actually think of creative, original ideas while listening to music? Or do you get too sucked into it? Do you get too sucked into the lyrics, to the beats, to whatever? Or maybe you start humming along and you're fully, you don't even realize it at first, but then you become fully focused on the music. And by the time you're done with your walk, you realize, wait a second, I've just been too sucked into my music this whole time. So, in those cases, you might have to take a step back and think, can I listen to music while I go for walks, while I take showers, while I do other mindless activities, things where I'm just sort of going through the motion, or just letting my mind wander as I go throughout my day and doing whatever things. For me, I can usually think of stuff while I'm listening to music while I'm on walks, but in a case where suddenly I'm just too distracted or I can't listen to music and think and do whatever at the same time, then I do one of two things. One, I'll just shut off my music and go back to my walk or go back doing whatever I was doing and just sort of sit in my brain for a bit. Or two, another thing that I might do is I might put on some white noise, some background static, and just listen to that while I walk. Something about that helps my brain focus in to be able to come up with creative questions, to think of ideas. Something about that empty white noise, my brain just wants to make patterns in it, and those patterns sometimes turn up in the way of ideas. So, number 2, go for walks, take showers, do other mindless activities. 3 is games. There are some games designed to push your brain to being more creative, and if you can't find one, you can make one up yourself. Here are some common examples that I like to use for trying to come up with more ideas. Some of these games are great to do in a group, some of these games are good to do just on your own. There's a mix of both. So, starting with the first game, the non-existent naming game. The idea is name X of Y that doesn't exist, such as name 5 car companies that don't exist. You take a couple seconds to start thinking, and then you got to go off the top of your head, just rapid fire. You have 60 seconds to do it. Come up with 5 car companies that don't exist. And when you do that, you're starting to push your brain, like, I need the answer to this, to this question, to this problem. And your brain starts rolling through ideas. Immediately, you're going to start thinking of car companies that do exist. And with that, you're like, I can't use those. I got to push farther, got to push deeper. And then once you push past that, you start thinking of, well, what are random objects that are around me that can suddenly come together to create a car company? And through that, you start coming up with original names back and forth, and it's great. You're able to start coming up with some often very funny, very humorous ideas. Perhaps they're not the creative ideas, the creative genius that you're hoping for, but it's often from those creative, funny, laughing out loud ideas that you can start getting some real other ideas that perhaps you might be more interested in doing. The second game I want to touch on is one I call the alternative uses game, where you take an object and you come up with X unintended uses for it for Y minutes. The idea is to take something like a pencil, you look at that pencil, you think to yourself, all right, the intended use for a pencil is to write down, it's to use it to write. What are going to be 30 unintended uses for this pencil? What else could I use this pencil for? Or perhaps you say, this pencil is designed to write things. I'm going to take 15 minutes and write down as many ideas as I possibly can for alternative uses for this pencil. This is starting to take your brain out of the, this is what you're supposed to do with this mindset, into a, what else can you do with this mindset? And once you start playing with objects like this, you start to think, well, if this is intended to be used this way, but it can be used this way, perhaps that's a new idea that I could approach and take a deeper dive at. Another similar game that I like to do is called the observation game, where I take a product or a situation and make a list of observations surrounding that product or situation. What are the problems with it, and how could they be better, for example? These two games, the alternative uses game and the observation game, are games that I like to use, especially when trying to come up with new product ideas, when trying to come up with new inventions, because inventing is designing a product to meet a need, to meet a problem, to solve that problem. So if you can find objects or look at situations and come up with problems and come up with solutions for those problems, if you make a game out of it, there you go, you're thinking creatively. One last game I want to touch on is one of my favorite games to do with friends, and it takes a bit to set up. It's called 1000 Blank White Cards, the card game where you make the cards, including cards that can change the rules. It's a very fun game. You have to find a couple people who are interested in doing it with you, but essentially how you play is you get a pack of 1,000 index cards. You don't need 1,000, but it's kind of fun to just get a big stack of index cards. You take about 30 minutes, you pass around index cards to everyone, and everyone starts designing cards for this game. Generally, the basic starting rules are you can play cards in one of 3-ish areas, either in your field, in another player's field, or in the center, which affects everyone. The goal of the game, initially, is to get as many points as possible, and then at the end of the game, whoever has the most points wins. You could decide that the end is perhaps when you use all the cards in the deck, or when you go X amount of rounds, or something like that. Then, as you play the game, oftentimes you'll get cards that have interesting interactions with each other, such as you play a card called Imaginary Friend, and suddenly a new player has entered the game called the Imaginary Friend. They have their own space. Whenever it's their turn, they draw a card and they play a card in the center on everyone. This player can win. There's whole new interactions or whole new rules just added because this card is put into play. Another example is a card that might be called Golf Rules, where instead of whoever has the most points wins at the end of the game, it's whoever has the closest to 0 points wins at the end of the game. So it's weird creative interactions like that. Or you could have other just simple cards like plus 100 points, a Major League Baseball game hot dog. You've purchased a delicious hot dog, you gain 100 points. There you go. Or other weird interactions, weird cards like that. The idea of this game is to really push your brain to start coming up with interesting ways of bending the rules or changing how things are done. And by doing that, you're not only being creative, but you're having fun with friends. And oftentimes by playing with friends, that's some of the best ways to be creative. And I'll touch on that a little bit more later. But that's number 3, games. That's my number 3 habit for being more creative. Next is habit number 4, research, reading, and studying. Particularly for me, that's going to be YouTube. But how do I use this to be more creative? If I want to be more creative surrounding a certain subject, it helps to expose your brain to that subject a bit more. It's a balance. Well, there's certainly a balance to this. You don't want to be too engrossed with things on YouTube that your brain gets fixed, that you get too absorbed into something that you don't actually go and do a thing. For me, the ideal point is you want to be at the very beginning of the Dunning-Kruger effect curve, where you're confident that you're able to do more than you actually understand that you'll be able to do. To make more sense of that, the Dunning-Kruger effect is that when you start learning a thing, at the very beginning you gain a bunch of confidence because you learn a bunch of new stuff, and at that very beginning you feel like, yeah, I can do anything. I understand this. I understand this much better than I really do. I think I understand this much better than I really do. Then after a bit more learning, you realize, oh, there's so much more to this than I first realized. Really, for me, the best point of that is to be at the very beginning there, when you feel like you understand this so much when in reality you don't. There's a reason for this. There's this challenge that many engineering companies will do, where if senior engineers can't solve a problem, claiming that it's impossible or it's too difficult or they'll never be done, the business leaders will often pass off that problem or that idea to newer, younger engineers, because these newer, younger engineers are at the beginning of that Dunning-Kruger effect, where they feel like they know just enough to do it, but they don't know enough to stop them from trying. And in many situations, it's these younger engineers who, in some ways, are less intelligent or less learned than the more experienced senior engineers, that they can come up with solutions to those problems that the senior engineers said, oh, it's impossible or you can't do it. So there's a limit to how much reading or studying or researching you should be doing before you start really trying to delve into creating or solving problems for whatever it is you're trying to do. But definitely for me, YouTube, reading, researching, studying, stuff like that can help me be so much more creative than one might realize. Fifth is meditating or just sitting with your thoughts. For me, this is going to look like laying on the couch with my headphones, listening to television static, as I mentioned before about going for walks. For me, music sometimes works well, but the best type of audio that I can be listening to become more creative is to just listen to television static. Listen to that white noise. There's this psychological principle called the Ganzfeld effect, where your brain tries to make sense of white noise or tries to make sense of blank stimulus. You can do this through white noise, through providing a blank stimulus to your vision by essentially covering it up with a white sheet of paper with some small splotches, like a very crudely done printer paper, having a sort of flat light behind it, and then just observing. What your brain is going to try to do is it's going to try to create patterns in the nothingness. And through those patterns, you're going to start seeing things, you're going to start hearing things. The best way I've heard it described is it's like you're going on a trip without taking any drugs, and it's really cool, really fun, totally safe to do. And essentially just by laying there and observing these blank stimulus, your brain's going to try to create patterns of it. It's going to try to make sense out of all of it. It's through those patterns and through intentionally thinking of, I want to solve this problem, or I want to come up with more ideas. It's through doing this, through planting those seeds in your brain of, I want to be more creative, I want to come up with ideas, and providing that blank stimulus, your brain's going to start coming up with ideas like crazy. It's going to start resolving patterns that don't exist in the white noise. You're going to start seeing things in the blank white sheet. And by doing this and just sitting with your thoughts and meditating, you never know what'll happen. Sometimes I go through a session of doing this and I don't get any good ideas. Sometimes I feel like I've gone on an adventure and I have some great ideas now for maybe a new D&D campaign, or for a new game I want to work on, or for a new podcast episode I want to talk about. You never know what's going to happen with this, so sit back, relax, and enjoy the visions. 6 is sharing and bouncing ideas off of friends. This is sort of like what I was talking about with playing 1,000 blank white cards, where it's not just you coming with interesting card ideas, it's everyone around you coming with interesting card ideas. Perhaps you'll need to go a round or two for people to start realizing, oh, wait a second, we can really push the bounds on this. Once you start getting people pushing the bounds on 1,000 blank white cards or other similar like group games like that, you can start getting some great ideas coming together. Or even just sitting down and bouncing ideas off of people to say, I have this idea to do this thing. What do you think? Then ask them to try to improve the idea or point out flaws in it. Because oftentimes when one brain does something on its own, it's usually not going to do all that great on its own. But if you have a couple people come together, other people can start pointing out flaws in the thing that you're doing, or they can start pointing out where you can improve certain things. And ultimately, it's when many brains come together, you can have great things happen. A great example of this is D&D and tabletop role-playing games. This is a great example of group creativity at work. You cannot get many of the same wonderful storytelling experiences that you get from a group storytelling game like D&D. You could sometimes maybe get something similar through reading books or going through novels or doing something like that. But you're not going to get anything quite like playing Dungeons and Dragons, sitting down at a table where you have a dungeon master loosely guiding you through a story or providing a framework for you to go through. But you also have the players also contributing. Players are going in and adding their own lore or adding their own characters or doing whatever it is they want to impact this world and make things change and bring things together and totally ruin plans. But it's great. It's through these creative storytelling experiences of many minds coming together to create group stories that you can get so many more amazing, awesome ideas. So sharing and bouncing ideas off of friends, getting together and really doing mind melds of sharing your ideas with everyone and seeing what comes out of it at the end, that can be some of the best times to be creative. 7 is working. Now you might think, Orion, why would working make you more creative? For me, this is just doing mindless work, mindless, easy work where the brain can wander. It's sort of like what I mentioned earlier of going for walks and taking showers. These are simple, repetitive movements that you're doing that just let your mind wander freely. Something to keep your body moving and keep your mind free. For me, a good example of this was growing up, we would stack piles of wood for winter for my family, and it was the perfect time to let my brain wander. Because it was simple. You take the wood, you go from point A, you put it at point B. And once you're at point B, you go back to point A and you repeat. You pick up the wood, you'll put down the wood. You pick up the wood, you put down the wood. So after a while doing that, your brain's going to wander and it's going to naturally try to entertain you and do things. So it's doing mindless work like that that can suddenly strike you with inspiration. But even if you're doing work that requires mental effort, sometimes in doing that, you're going to start thinking about, how can I do this better? How can I make this easier? Because human beings are naturally lazy creatures. We want to make things as easy, as simple as possible for the most part. So when we're doing something complicated, when we start looking at these situations, we start playing the observation game unintentionally, we start looking at things. So we start saying, there's a problem here. How can I make this problem better? How can I make this easier? A good example of this is I'm currently working a job where I have to do a lot of calculations. I have to do a lot of the same calculations over and over and over again. And our calculators aren't the best, so it's very easy to push a wrong button or for a button to not input correctly. So what did I do? I said, there's a problem here, and I think I know how to solve it. I took that problem and I said, I know the formulas that we're using time and time and time again, and I know the variables that we're changing. So can I create a spreadsheet that can automatically do all the calculations for me and make it so I don't have to make these mistakes? And I put together a little spreadsheet, and it works. It took a little bit of trial and error, and I made a couple of mistakes on it, a couple of big mistakes, but those were fixed over time, and now I have a spreadsheet that does everything that I needed to do. I don't have to think, I don't have to punch in numbers on a calculator that's going to break half the time, and in the end, I'm always going to get consistently the same result. So that was problem solving at work. That was creativity at work. I had a problem, I observed it, I solved it, and that all came from me being at work, doing something time and time again. So working can be one of the best ways to foster creativity. 8 is mindless play. For me, the best way I can describe this is sitting down and playing with Legos, playing with Play-Doh, or playing with other little toys with no particular goal from the outset. Just sit down and play for a while. You don't have to have an objective. It's going to struggle. You're going to struggle for a little bit at the beginning of, well, what do? I just sort of put things together and see what happens. And yes, that's exactly what you do. You sit down and you start putting something together like, oh, okay. You go out with no objective of what do I want to do. You just sit down and you just start playing. Do what kids used to do. Do what you used to do as a kid. Where you just sit down with a bunch of Legos, like, awesome. What do I make with this? You just start putting pieces together and see what happens. Mindless play can be one of the best ways to foster creativity and come up with new ideas. 9 is working on inherently creative projects. Many of the best ideas that I came up with were while I was working on other projects. I was already in a creative state of being, so while I'm working on one thing, perhaps I'm in a lull for a while on one project, I suddenly get struck with another idea for a project, and I'll switch to that. And for me, what this looks like is I'm usually balancing 2 or 3 projects at a time. A good example of this was when I was writing my first book, Mentors Make Men. Started this when I was in college, so for me that became my creative project outside of schooling. So I'd go to school, I would do all my homework, do all that, and I would come home and I would start writing my book. And after a while, I need a break from this. I need another creative thing. And while that was happening, I suddenly learned about silversmithing and creating jewelry and thought, I can do that. That can be my next creative project. So then my life became bouncing between school, writing, and silversmithing, school, writing, and silversmithing. Whenever I had a problem with one of them, say I came across a problem with my homework that I wasn't solving, I would bounce over to writing. When I hit a problem with my writing, I would bounce over to silversmithing. When I hit a problem with my silversmithing, I would bounce back over to homework. And by doing that, I would often solve the problems that I was having with another project by working on a different project. By working on silversmithing, I suddenly had a strike of inspiration of, oh, wait a second, this is how I solved that homework problem. When I was doing my homework, I realized, wait a second, this is how I want to phrase this section of my book, and stuff like that, where I'd bounce in between projects, and by doing that, it helped me stay in a creative state, but never get too sucked into one thing where I might get burned out. So, working on other creative projects. Last, but certainly not least, number 10, just doing whatever makes you feel creative. I obviously can't hit everything. I can't hit every single creative hobby there is out there, or every hobby that'll help you foster creativity. And there are just so many habits and hobbies that have worked well for me to foster creativity, I can't even go through and name all of them because I don't remember all of them. Oftentimes, you just have to sit down and think, what do I do that makes me feel creative? And go from there. So, with all that in mind, there's 4 principles of creativity that I came out with after listing all these things. When I think about creativity, there are these 4 things that come to mind when I think, okay, if I want to be creative, how do I do it? What are the actual fundamentals of being creative? And these are the 4 things that came to mind for me. First off is quantity means quality. When you look at all the good ideas that people come up with around you, you think, wow, that person just comes up with so many good ideas. How do they do it? Oftentimes you don't see the hundreds or thousands of horrible ideas that came before, or maybe not even horrible, just bad or mediocre ideas that came before. You can overcome the quality issue by just producing a bunch of ideas. So it doesn't matter how good or how bad the idea is. If you come up with an idea, write it down and keep on going. That brings me to that second point. Write it or lose it. Keep a notebook on you at all times. You probably get more ideas than you realize. So whenever you get a good idea, whenever you get any idea, write it down immediately. And sometimes when you start writing down an idea, you get another and another and another. It becomes hard to stop and you get a series of ideas one after the next. I know for me, sometimes there will be days where I don't write anything down. And then suddenly I sit down like, oh, I have an idea. And then I just write out 20 to 30 ideas all in one go of, wow, I didn't know that I had all these in me. Not all of them are good. Certainly, most of them are very bad. But I keep on going and I look back there every once in a while and I realize, wait a second, I came up with this idea before. I came up with it 2 or 3 times now over the past 4 or 5 months. Maybe this is a better idea than I thought it was. Then I look into it a bit more, actually this is a pretty good idea. What would it take for me to keep on doing this a little bit more? And it's amazing what'll happen. But it ultimately starts from write it or lose it. If you think you're going to be able to remember that good idea later, don't, because our brains are not designed to just remember everything. Our brains are designed to come up with ideas, to come up with solutions, not to remember, not to be almanacs for things. That's what we have computers for. That's what we have notebooks for. Use our brains for our specialties. Our brains are great at coming up with things, but we're not so good at recalling or remembering or just hanging on to things. Next, in a similar vein to write it or lose it, is treat good creative ideas as if they're a dime a dozen. If you think of ideas as being a scarce resource, they will be. This is more of a mindset shift than anything else, where if you think that you're not going to have any good ideas ever again, 1, you're probably wrong, and 2, you're probably going to lose out on a bunch of good ideas that you could have had if you weren't so stuck in your thinking that, oh, I'm never going to have any good ideas again. It's this one or it's no other idea. I have to make this one work. When really, there's probably tens of millions of great ideas out there that you could very easily find. Treat good ideas as if they're a dime a dozen, and trust me, they will be. Finally, this is going to be a bit of a contentious one for some people, but the last main principle of creativity, principle 4, is limitations and rules can breed creativity. This is going to be a counterintuitive idea to many people who think limitation breeds creativity. What do you mean? Limitations are stifling creativity, but let me explain. If you don't have rules or limitations, everything is an option, which quickly leads to analysis paralysis. So having some very simple rules and limitations can often give you a framework to work around. It also gives you the opportunity to work around said limitations and create new, interesting, out-of-the-box solutions. So, in summary, with all this, there are many habits that you can do to foster creativity and to help you generate more creative ideas. Everything from exercising to gaming and so much more. When all is said and done, what I believe will help you the most to be more creative is those final 4 principles I shared. Quantity means quality, treat good ideas like they're a dime a dozen, write it or lose it, and limitations breed creativity. But what do you think? Do you have a habit that helps you be more creative, or did I miss some sort of key principle of creativity? Let me know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this episode, then please share it with a friend you think would like it, or share it on social media. It would absolutely mean the world to me, and it helps the podcast grow so much. With all that said, thanks for listening. I greatly appreciate it, and I'll talk to you all later.